Welcome to our final talk of the Jean Monnet Center Montreal Winter 2021 Speaker Series. I'm Juliette Johnson, Professor of Political Science at McGill and a member of the Center. This particular talk is co-sponsored by the Center and by the BEAR Network, that is the Jean Monnet Network between the EU and Russia, which are both funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. So what we're going to do today is start with our speaker presentation. This will be followed by discussant comments from Magdalena Dembinska of the University of Montreal, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. The talk itself will be recorded, but not the Q&A, so feel free to ask whatever you want. When you do, please use the raise hand function, and I'll acknowledge you that way. We'll go until 11 o'clock today. And again, I'm really pleased to have with us Dr. Maria Koinova, who's professor of international relations at the University of Warwick. Her research interests span international relations, comparative politics, and international political sociology, and focus on how migration, diasporas, and ethno-national diversity impact the political development of conflict and post-conflict societies. She's published widely on all of these issues, and today she's going to be talking to us about her imminently forthcoming Oxford University Press book, Diaspora, Entrepreneurs in Contested States. So Maria, great to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juliette and Magdalena, for the invitation to present this new book. Actually, it is out from 26th of March, only in the UK, though. In North America, is going to be available in May. So it is hot off the press. Thank you very much, and thank you also for the BEAR network that I'm part of through Warwick University for co-sponsoring this event. And I'm looking forward to talking to people after that when the Q&A session. Always interesting to hear different perspectives on the book. So the book is a result of a large-scale European Research Council project, which was called Diasporas and Contested Sovereignty, and I directed it as a principal investigator from 2012 to 2017. So this was a very big, really large-scale data gathering and theory building endeavor to look into the role of conflict-generated diasporas, which means those that have been created by way of violence or repression and that have moved abroad and have created some sort of roots there, whether long-term or more short-term. But the most important thing for that project was that we were looking into the European context, into 5 countries, the UK, Sweden, Germany, Netherlands, and France. And for this book, I also added Switzerland, because it was important, especially for the Kosovo diaspora, that I will spend a little bit more time talking today. And I also did research in Brussels with regard to institutions of the European Union. And this is something that is very relevant to your center, apparently. I did research for this book also in Kosovo and in Armenia, because I have been looking into how diasporas that come from de facto states. Kosovo has been recognized largely by now, but not by all members of the international system. Karabakh is not even recognized by Armenia, and we know all of this. Many developments that have been happening in the past half a year there, and Palestine has a very mixed record of recognitions. So usually statelets in emergence of that sort are searching for all kinds of ways in order to pursue their goal for independence or for more recognition abroad. But diaspora is a very much identity-based connection to the country has been very important. So this is a little bit about the background. So the big European Research Council project had multiple researchers. Others were working on the Bosnian, the Iraqi, and the Kurdish diaspora, and we launched a huge survey of diasporas of the Iraqi, Palestinian, and Kurdish in the UK, Sweden, and Germany. So hard to reach populations that have been polled and researched with my book specifically in a very in-depth way, but also with the breadth of it, like 7 countries in Europe and other 2 in the European neighborhood. So I will focus here specifically on the book, so that which is one of the major deliverables out of this big project, so that you can see the theory that has been emerging out of there, and also the data that backs it. Here I start my book with 3 sketches, and I say the one is about a Kosovar who he has already become a UK citizen, and whom I interviewed in Pristina in 2013. So he recalled how he returned to Kosovo at the peak of the 1999 war. So, I mean, for a background, Kosovars for a very long time after 1989, and the democratic changes that were happening in that part of the world, were seeking autonomy, but then they declared independence, which actually unleashed a very strong Serbian response of the Serbian regime at that time under Slobodan Milosevic. And it gave it took people out of work, took people out of any kind of support from the state, and actually helped in that way induce a parallel society. So what this person that I interviewed in Kosovo, like long years later, right, in he reminiscent about 1999, which was at the peak of the war. That was a time when Serbian forces and paramilitaries and different kind of like semi-military formations from the Kosovo resistance at the time were fighting in Kosovo, and the huge movements of refugees and huge problems were happening with that, with regards to the human rights violations. So this person, that's the background, right? This person reminiscence about this and says, I could not just sit in front of the TV and watch how the rest of the world was trying to free my country while I was doing nothing about it. And he was deliberating how he saw a bullet in the head of a small child, and he thought that this child is the same kind of age as his son in London, and then this is a real serious problem. And even if he has hesitated for a long time to go to Kosovo, he jumped on the next opportunity, and he went there. So in this kind of more contentious ways in how one engages in conflict by way of trying to fight for the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was that kind of more radical faction. So this is one way to channel interest from abroad when you want to have a statehood. The other is shown by the way of the lobby activities of a politician of Armenian origin in Sweden, who found the way of exerting political influence to Homeland Affairs in a different way. And he said, when I started working in the parliament, the first bill I wrote was about the Armenian genocide. And then was an explanation also in the book how this was induced by some conversations with Kurds and about what was the role of the French passing a similar bill. So it is important to commemorate the Armenian genocide, but this book is about the ways of mobilizing around this. And this snippet here of text shows very clearly that this is more through lobbying the political institutions of the host state activity. And the third one is from my third case, which is about Palestine. And this was an activist of Palestinian origin in the Netherlands, who said that after the 1993 Oslo Accords that created certain peace in that territories, by now totally revamped, he said that it became important for the Palestinian diaspora to let the Palestinian Authority talk about states, while the Palestinians in the diaspora decided to focus on issues which were left out of the Oslo Accords, for example, the refugees. And activities for the refugees have been both non-contentious but also contentious. So in that sense, my three snippets of stories are showing the contentious way, purely contentious, the one that is more mixed bag, which is the third one, mixed strategy, and the one that is definitely taking the lobby road. So in this sense, I have two central questions of this book. And they are why do conflict-generated diasporas mobilize in contentious and non-contentious ways, or use a mixed approach towards the countries of origin which have these problems of contested sovereignty? So here I spoke long when I was presenting the project. The contested sovereignty I consider mostly to be a contested sovereignty domestically and internationally. And with de facto states, this is also very clearly an international dimension. Because if you are a de facto state and you need a recognition from the United Nations, you will engage the diaspora probably in a completely different way than if there is a state that is a weak state, like Iraq, for example, or Bosnia, but does not need international recognition. So in that sense, contested sovereignty matters in a specific way for my story, which is about de facto states, although it may have larger repercussions theoretically that I will discuss later in this presentation. So the first question is looking about contention. How contentious certain mobilizations are, and I have three values: contentious, non-contentious, and mixed, which is which I call that dual-pronged contention, mixing, lobbying, and contentious politics. So the second one is that one can channel their homeland-oriented goals for that building of statehood in a different way. So one can be contentious and non-contentious when it comes to host states, when it comes to transnational networks or international organizations. While sometimes we think, okay, how can you be a contentious actor in international organizations? Quite clearly, you get yourself through a huge transnational process right in front of the UN building in Geneva, or try to do similarly in front of buildings of embassies of certain countries in host states. This is definitely a certain sort of contentious engagement. Transnational networks do not need to be engaged in contentious ways, but they can be engaged in contentious ways as well. So this is important to think about the variations that can be also in the channeling of interest. So these are my two central questions. So the book is very important about showing not how much host states matter or homelands, but how context matters. And this is a really important idea of the book, because I look into context, but in different ways than if one considers hostlands, home states, and diasporas in certain kind of rigid relationship. What I discuss and present in this book, but also build on some earlier work that I have started like developing these ideas, is about the socio-special positionality perspective, which means that one is embedded in context through their social relationships in a specific way. And that positionality actually matters about how one is embedded in context. I mean, bear with me for a while, and I will show this to you through forthcoming graphs about how does this really mean differently than other ideas about positionality. So the idea there is that this book is challenging the statist theories that analyze diasporas in conflict processes, primarily as the interaction of these homeless host states and diasporas, but thinks about how a person, what I call a diaspora entrepreneur, because they mobilize others, is positioned relatively in one context versus another. And what context means, I'm coming to more clearly explain. So a lot of the scholarship on diasporas, but also on migration, has been trying to get away from these essentialist views about diasporas as groups. And yet we keep on going as diasporas, the Lebanese in Canada, the Bulgarians in the UK, etc. Right? And then more recently, there has been understanding that there are certain groups may matter within these groups, that they may have certain either class affiliations or certain political affiliations, etc. I take the conversation even further and unpack it on the level of the individual diaspora entrepreneur. And we just recently had a conversation about the importance of individual diaspora agency at ISA. And I think this is really important to emphasize, because individual diaspora agency matters about how a big impact can be created by way of very few people. And once these people, and how are they identified? Okay, so these are the three big, like large-scale contributions: context, shapes, through socio-spatial positionality perspective, and we look into the individual level. So the key argument of the book is that these individual diaspora entrepreneurs operate in transnational social fields that affect their mobilizations beyond dynamics confined to these home state dynamics. And I argue that there are four types of diaspora entrepreneurs. I mean, created my abstract categories. There are humans, which are based on their relative strength of socio-spatial linkages to different contexts, about how they are connected to people in place, which means the broker, the local, the distant, and the reserved, and this is how I call them, have different constellations of relationships to different contexts, and they are relative to each other. So if one is based, let's say, in Canada, and they are completely separated from all the political sphere of their country of origin, they will fall into my local category. But if one is very connected and trying to pursue all kinds of relationships through different global contexts, they probably will be a broker, and they will be still in the same place. The second major contribution of this book is to develop the so-called two-level topological theory that captures 9 causal pathways that show these socio-spatial linkages of these diaspora entrepreneurs and how they interact with external factors. Such pathways produce mobilizations that vary in how contentious they are and how they channel homeland interests. And I mean, if you look into the very key argument of the book, I see that there are 4 pathways that are more contentious, 4 pathways that are associated with dual prong contention, and 1 pathway that is associated with a very contentious activity. So I will unpack all of this. So right, I'm coming to that. So one by one. So I think this is a very new idea about to think about diaspora entrepreneurs as strength, relative strength and weakness of socio-spatial linkages. And in that sense, a person has a specific socio-spatial positionality. Let me take a step back and explain about how we think about positionality so far. Usually we think about positionality as an identity-based characteristic. So if this is a woman and is based in a patriarchal society, the power of this woman would be much smaller than if this were in a, let's say, in a more open to endorsement women society like Sweden, for example. So it could be the same person, like physically the same person, but it would be in a different context where positionality will be different. But it's based on an identity-based characteristic. Sometimes it has come also with regards to issues of researcher-based positionality. So if one is a researcher and goes into the field, and maybe that would be interesting for some of the PhD students, right? So one goes into the field and they have certain positionality. They're a woman of a certain class, or a man, white male from a certain class, and that others perceive them through that power lens. But it also depends on who the others are. This is also identity-based. So what I'm making a difference here, and I say, this is not what I'm talking about. This may be generating some of what I'm observing out there, but it's not at the core of it. At the core of it is that the individual diaspora entrepreneurs have different linkages to context. So, for example, they have very strong linkages to politicians in their country of origin, to civil society, to civil society, to non-state actors. They may have also connections to political parties in the host lands. They may be running for elections themselves, etc. So they will, in that kind of sense, they will have strong linkages. But they will have much less strength in their linkages if they have very little influence on the public sphere, but it goes much more into the private sphere. If they have connections simply to family and transnational relationships based on that, they wouldn't be very strong. So in the combination of these strengths and weaknesses of these relationships, no matter where they come from, whether they come from somebody who is more kind of leadership oriented or somebody who has more it's some kind of desired characteristic, identity-based characteristic. This is not as important here, but it's important to think about the socio-spatial positionality, how a person is embedded in context relative to another. And my people here, the broker, the local, the distant, and the reserved, they're exhibiting these different kind of relationships. So the broker has strong connections, of the socio-spatial connections to people in place, both in a host land where they have immigrated to, but also in a homeland or another global context. So as I said, it is important to think, especially to unpack this idea of the homeland diaspora, but to think another global context may also influence diaspora entrepreneurs, and they may be connected to it. If you think one is a Palestinian, let's say, and lives in London, and they may have equally strong connections to Palestinians who are in the in the Palestinian camps in Lebanon, in the West Bank, in Gaza, or somewhere that may be on the road to try to kind of cross through Europe or somewhere else, or in other parts of the world, right? That person is physically in one place, but their connectivities are not in one home country where they necessarily come from, right? But where the cause is really important in development. In that sense, my story about de facto states, which are usually a product of incomplete nation and state building, are very important because in what we talk here, for example, about Kosovo, there has been Albanians that are living in Albania proper, right, in Albania, in Macedonia, in now North Macedonia, then be living in Montenegro, being in Kosovo, and then if you think about outside of the region, maybe living also in the diaspora already because of a lot of migration patterns. And in that sense, they are not simply in Kosovo. Even if one is a mobilizer for Kosovo, right, or comes from Kosovo, they may be mobilizing for other parts of the Albanian space, and vice versa. A lot of Albanians from Albania proper, as long as there was no future prospects for any kind of statehood for Kosovo, the biggest goal for anybody in the Albanian space was to have Kosovo independence. So sometimes if we have this kind of statist lens to see international relations, that will confuse. If we look here from this, what I mentioned, more comparative way beyond what Wimmer and Schiller call a methodological nationalism, we can see the world in a different way. It actually happens in the diaspora. So that's the broker. So it's connected to the host land, to a homeland, and another global context, and has strong linkages in all of them. The local is the proverbial good and well-integrated citizen that hostland authorities want to see. They come to the country, they acquire the culture, they become really well-integrated and see their relationships apart from family abroad, and they don't do anything else. Right? I mean, many people are like this. A lot of for example, in my Armenian case that I study, and we are also here in the Bear Network that may be also of interest. In the Armenian case, a lot of the diaspora entrepreneurs are locals in terms of like the count in my a large data set, and I have a huge data set, which is about 156 interviewees that are coded and 300 interviews that inform the whole study. So that local is very clearly the one that is well integrated and has very little connections to the country of origin or another global context. So now the interesting category is the opposite of it. So there are people, maybe not as many as the locals, but they are closer to the countries of origin and other contexts than to the country of settlement. And initially that came from some of the interviews from the Palestinian researchers said, like, you know what, I am here in body, but I'm there in heart and mind. And that kind of started repeating itself in different ways from the context. And I was like, that sounds like something. Let me look deeper into that. And this is how actually the distant emerged, because this is basically a person who is physically in one context, but their relationships and contacts are stronger somewhere else. And if they mobilize relatively stronger in the place where the contacts are stronger. And they may be in other parts of the world, which means for a Palestinian, for example, that would be in the West Bank and Gaza, or in Palestinian camps in Lebanon rather than in Britain. And in Britain, that may be a little bit of the activity. So, and then we have the reserved. The reserved is an interesting category because it's not simply the person that is being mobilized, but these are people who hang out in a community, and they organize the community, and whether these are Kosovars abroad or Albanians or any other. So, but they do not become very active all the time. And while some of research has mentioned that these are this kind of latent diaspora and so on, it's kind of literally came to kind of go only on the surface of this and not show when do they emerge, how do they emerge, under what conditions. So this is where my book is bringing a lot of this contextualization and analysis about when does the reserved become really active. Okay, so now if this were a statist analysis, you will see now a map of the world with a lot of country borders. Apparently not for time of pandemic research, but prior to the pandemic. But you will see a globe and a field in which a person operates. So that kind of red dot out there is a Palestinian diaspora entrepreneur that I discussed shortly in the book. And then this person has connections, as I mentioned, to the West Bank and Gaza, to Palestinian camps in Lebanon, but also may have connections to family dynamics, people who have migrated in other parts of Europe with the same wave or another wave. And it's like a lot of this transnational field is out there, and the connectivities are pretty thick. But that person may have also a relationship with relationships that follow those of host states or places that are within them. And here I'm saying that one can, for example, have relationships to Commonwealth countries if one is mobilized maybe stronger than to any other, let's say, Latin American countries or any others. But they still may have a relationship to those places where other large diasporas live. So here the idea is it's not simply connected to people where big diasporas are, although this is not something to say no, but it is about follow the linkages of states, linkages of people, linkages of places in which they live, and how they follow them in order to build these mobilization patterns. So if we imagine this kind of like a broker, distant and local and reserved, with their linkages, I mean, they're like people of flesh and blood, right? I don't want to kind of create too structural analysis. People of flesh and blood, but they have specific linkages that can change over time, right? One can have a fluid relation with a certain point, like with the Kosovo case, for example, during the war until 1999, somebody might have been a broker. And then after the war says, I had enough of this. I cannot deal with this anymore. I'm integrating. And there were a lot of these people in Sweden, for example, who became business entrepreneurs, supporting people, destitute in Kosovo, but never engaging anymore in politics. while in other contexts, or even in Sweden, others remain. So which means that there is a choice that is inside, right? One can make the choice about the fluidity of that relationship, regardless of how strongly that person is shaped by identity or other positionality that I mentioned earlier. So if we look at the broker, the distant, the local, and reserved on these figures, they have linkages that are to those different contexts. And here I'm developing the idea about how these linkages are going to be impacted upon. Not every person will be impacted in the same way in the diaspora, because if you have strong linkages to host country, maybe there will be a lot more things in that host country that will matter for you. New policies that come up, new relationships, not only the foreign policy towards your hostland that actually concerns everybody, but you will be much more susceptible to who is in power and who is running for elections in your own, let's say in your constituency, how you may be able to do that. This would not matter for somebody who lives in the same place, but they are really connected to other parts of the world. And this is where, for example, famine may matter, or elections in that kind of country may matter, or something like changing of power in that kind of country will matter. So their relationships to place will be impacted in a different way. So that's why this is what I call the politically relevant environment. So I haven't invented this. I have built this on Mao's work on politically relevant international environment, and that was a work from 1996, which I found very good because it was showing specific regional patterns in the international system. So it is a systemic book about international systemic effects, and basically has a realist underpinnings. So I take this idea at its core, but not all of its premises, etc., and I take it and I think about it how this socio-positional dynamic matters. So not everybody is impacted in the same way in the diaspora, and this is what matters. Some factors will become much more politically relevant for a diaspora entrepreneur in a certain place because of their connections to other countries and the ways they're connected strongly or weakly than to others. And this is how this interconnectivity between the endogenous relationships that a diaspora entrepreneur has in terms of their connectivities interact with external events that hit on them. If you think about, if you have hands, and that's how I kind of semi-designed the cover of my book. On one hand is stretched in one direction and covered on the other, and there is stretched in the other direction and covered on the other. Who hits that hands? What really becomes relevant for that hands? I mean, if it rains, there will be hail, and it will hit the hand that is open, but probably will not affect the one that is closed. I mean, I'm trying to bring this to kind of like the popular imagination to think about how the interaction of these linkages really connects to these external factors. And this is how the version of my two-level typological theory looks like. On the one side, you have the diaspora entrepreneur with the different types of linkages, the broker, the local, distant, and reserved. On the other side is the hostland foreign policy and how it relates to the countries of origin goal, whether it is divergent from it or it is convergent. This is a condition that everybody who lives in a certain state needs to deal with, because if they want to change something, they need to consider that foreign policy. So this is like a variable that has convergent and divergent aspects, but is always there. So in this kind of typological theory, where you have a certain Boolean minimization logic, although it's not really a Boolean algebra here, you have connections between and certain factors become added and certain factors alternate. So always a type of diaspora entrepreneur is added to a hostland foreign policy, whether it's divergent or convergent, but then the influences from the countries of origin and other global contexts may be different. So I have to basically three conditions here. There are more than three conditions, but the one is the no condition, which is there are limited global influences. Basically, you can imagine a diaspora entrepreneur just living in one place, and they have very little that comes their way from the country of origin. Nobody tries from the host country to ask them to vote. Nobody asks them to mobilize. Nobody asks them to send remittances. They just do all on their autonomous will. And this is really important, and I will give you examples from the coming discussion about how this could happen even under very difficult conditions when the foreign policy of the host land is adverse to the goal of the diaspora entrepreneurs. So this is something that usually we think about, oh, these governments or of countries of origin are all powerful, or the no-state actors or the parties, and they can superimpose themselves on anybody. No, there is space for autonomy, although it may be limited depending on what kind of time and period we are looking at. So then I'm looking into homeland influences, and recently there has been a very strong discussion about how these homeland influences have developed from country governments. I mean, the work of Myra Waterbury, for example, has been one of the first that has been there in this, and Francesco Ragazzi. More recently, Alan Ganlan has a big work. I mean, I have worked with Gerasimos Tsourapas on this, and so a lot of other scholars have come up with the idea that homeland governments are extending themselves to the diasporas abroad in various ways. I mean, this is not a conversation for now at least, but this is the idea that they can extend themselves to the diaspora, but they can extend themselves in specific ways and not in others. This could be done by way of parties. Some parties may campaign abroad. Some parties may not. Some non-state actors may seek the diaspora abroad, like, I mean, secessionist groups or terrorist groups, etc. Others may not. So it is contextually based. It's a very contextually based discussion. But then the other part is that, I mean, first of all, the limited global influences, nobody acts, right? There is no specific action. With the homeland influences, there is a very clear cut action type. Somebody is there developing the strategy towards the diaspora. And critical events are something which is maybe a breakdown of a system, or something that breakdown of violence that happens large scale or small scale, but really has an impact on the diaspora. Could be rigged elections, could be many other things, kind of critical events that are watched from the diaspora and matter to them. So, and when we combine this in different combinations, and I developed 9 causal pathways, and I'll unpack 3 of them. I'll show you all of them and the results, but I just unpacked 3 of them to give you a bit more kind of discussion from the causal case. All of that, when they combined in their specific combinations, they come to mobilization trajectories that are showing how contentious or non-contentious or dual-pronged contentious a pathway can be, and also to what degree and how the interest is channeled through the hostland transnationally and supranationally. And I mean, if you kind of look at this, it could be IV1, IV2, IV3, and then DV, but then there is not additive logic all the time. It is kind of alternation as well. The final thing I want to say is that the conditions are endogenous to diaspora entrepreneurs, so with regards to the type of diaspora entrepreneur, but exogenous with regard to how these external events and processes hit them, and to what degree they reach out to them, and once they reach out to them, what really this leads to. Okay, so basically, if I skip the whole book, which is, I mean, I will come back to it, but I mean, the book has 2 theoretical chapters. First, an introduction, which I sent to Magdalena. It has 2 theoretical chapters. The one is about the macro perspective, about how diasporas are building these transnational social fields, especially how de facto statehood matters there, and how a relational dynamic in relational thinking can give impetus to think beyond these characteristics of diaspora entrepreneurs as fixed entities, but something that is much more relational. The second theoretical chapter is called the micro perspective, and this is where it goes into the measurement about how different diaspora entrepreneurs linkages are measured on the basis of their statements, of course. But I mean, what does it mean, etc. Talks about the data set, the politically relevant environment, and unpacks specifics about each of the causal pathways. So, and then there are three other sections. There is the Kosovo chapter. I send you the smaller chapter because I mean the other is huge, and given the time, we wouldn't be able to kind of like look at all of that. Then it has two chapters for Kosovo, the field, and then the mobilization of the different diasporas on causal pathways. Similarly about the Palestinian case, and similarly about the Armenian case. So I mean, now then, I mean, if we go to the what is the result of all of this? Going deeper into each of these pathways is this table, and it's in the conclusions, and it's showing that there is on the one side you have non-state, non-contentious, dual-prong contentious, and contentious outcomes. Then if you try to position them by, I mean, I've done a lot of coding. I mean, in the appendix, it's described about how many categories each interview has been put in. And if you look into these observations, you could see the 9 pathways that attract observations of each of the interviews, and whether one is a broker, a local, and distant, or reserved. So, I mean, just for example, pathway 1, for example, is a combination between the diaspora entrepreneur, foreign policy convergence towards the diaspora goal, and limited global influence. Then the second pathway is alternating. So here it is a foreign policy divergence and the limited global influences. But you could see that the first pathway was observed only in the Kosovo case, while the second pathway is visible on all 3 cases. And so on. So, I mean, foreign policy convergence, homeland government, homeland parties, non-state actors, etc. So when we talk about diasporas in conflict processes, so kind of still a bit of a superficial discussion is tilted on the very right side where you see this 65 and pathway 9, because this is what we see when we talk about diasporas in conflict. Or everybody goes there, takes up arms, goes there, fights, fundraisers, etc. This kind of fears and that are totally shaping discourses. And you could see definitely that there is some sort of substantiation of that, because it is prevalent when critical events are happening in the countries of origin or adjacent to its context. It has the strongest impact on all diaspora entrepreneurs, and you see that the brokers are 28, the local 19, the distant 21, the reserved is 7. And they are all participating on that pathway. So very little opportunity for not to be engaged. But if we look all the way back, right, from the other 8 pathways, this is not always the case, right? Even if sometimes very counterintuitively one may think that non-state actors are really inciting diasporas abroad, the evidence, at least from this data set, shows that they are mostly using dual-pronged contention. So they would try to have what some people have called diaspora diplomacy, or even rebel diplomacy. They may try to be in softer ways to present themselves in nicer to try to lobby as well on the one side, while they try to give more demonstrations or petitions or hunger strikes or like fundraising for all kinds of other things on the other. So in that sense, pathway 5 is also, first of all, is quite populated as well. I mean, there are 2 Palestinian cases on that one. But it's very different than the usual narrative of these diasporas are real conflict mongers. And then we go really on the non-contentious side, and we see that there are very pathways. So one can arrive at a certain outcome by way of different pathways. I mean, this is like the proverbial idea about equifinality. right? And here, if you look into pathway 2, where we have foreign policy divergence and global influences, one can still see autonomous action and non-contentious action even when foreign policy is not compliant or not aligned with the diaspora goals. So, I mean, this is a really interesting showing that a lot matters in terms of what we see and do not see in diaspora politics. First, about that we sometimes think only about diaspora entrepreneurs as the blockers, right? Well, there are many others that are socio-positionally different and act in different levels. And the second is that, we usually see pathway 9 when we talk about diasporas in conflict, and maybe somebody who tries to build remittances and build some kind of post-conflict reconstruction that may be close to pathway 1 or pathway 3. All the rest is missing, and this is what is very important about this book, is putting it on that agenda in a much more unpacked way, so that it shows the specifics, but also in a comparative way, so that it has certain sort of meso-level generalization. If a pathway repeats itself with similar outcomes and similar processes in several cases, this actually can bring to generalization. So let me give you some kind of like evidence about this to see how it sounds in the Kosovo case. I promised to Juliet I will talk mostly about the Kosovo case with regard to the empirics. On pathway 2, we have this connection between diaspora entrepreneurs, the whole state foreign policy is divergent, and limited global influences. This brings to non-contentious politics, but then different channeling among the different diaspora entrepreneurs. So I took here for this discussion only one short period of time in the Kosovo movement, because, I mean, for the time I cannot really kind of concentrate something meaningful. So for me, it's important to show you from 89 to basically 99, mostly 2000, how different diaspora entrepreneurs, even if it were a conflict period, secessionist period, right, that usually is branded diasporas are warmongers, we have such a big variety, right? And you need to look deeper into that. So under this pathway, a broker in the Netherlands who is acting more autonomously, as you will see, was labeled by the two Kosovo formations, which were fighting for the attention of the diaspora. So these were the more moderate Kosovo LDK, Democratic League of Kosovo, and the more radical Kosovo Liberation Army. So, and he says the following: the best thing that happened to us, because when parties are claiming you to belong to the other, you are going in the middle. The person organized visits for LDK activists to spread information about human rights violations, but emphasized they did not dictate my agenda. And whether this is true or not, I mean, we can only speculate, but this is what's stated, right? But one thing is that you will see that the statement completely varies from what is said by somebody in a similar position, similar socio-spatial position, when is very connected to a non-state actor. So bear this in mind. So when still on pathway 2, we think about the local in Germany. For example, this person acted much more close to their hostland environment, founded different clubs to pursue sports, culture, Albanian club in Frankfurt, and then in a two-step process, once these organizations were initially formed, the person started looking for contact with German agencies to organize events with them, fairs, community fairs, etc. So it is a very local type of lobbying dynamic, but it's very clear it is about Kosovo and the migrants and their independence, bringing up the issue to the political agenda. So then Reserved in Germany has a different way of channeling. So it's like in the States says, oh, I always try to network and integrate, starting with the student union. Overwhelmed by their refugee experience and grateful to be alive, the individual gained consciousness that refugees should not be treated badly in democratic societies and started campaigning in their support. So you could see like the first person said like equidistant from all these parties, I will try to do and seek civil society, because this is how this person was mostly mobilizing to organizing Dutch civil society and international networks. The second was about local clubs and creating some sort of like proto-partnerships with journal organizations. And the third was really looking into bringing awareness about the refugee experience. The interesting thing, I didn't find a distant in my dataset. So now I can say, is this because the dataset has interviewed no distance, or a distance is not a category? I think that could be both in a different way. I mean, this could be looked further into, but the distance is not on this pathway. Definitely, in the sense that there is a very little likelihood that they engage. And if you think about why is this the case, it's because, I mean, when distance are very connected to countries of origin and their political projects, it's very difficult that they are also little influenced. But what this pathway is telling us is that even in the most difficult times, when different political factions are bickering for the attention of diaspora entrepreneurs, even the brokers, etc., one can still have a largely independent, or at least perceived as independent and autonomous action. And my book talks a lot about how we think about autonomy, because a lot more of this is really needs to be on the radar screen. So the second pathway I want to present to you is pathway 5, where we have the diaspora entrepreneur combining with a foreign policy divergence. So it's like a difficult context, right? It's not that somebody is helping them, because in the book you can read about Kosovo, for example, after the end of the war, and there is much more about Kosovo government engaging diasporas for public diplomacy, etc. But I mean, I cannot focus on this now. So here I'm in this conflict period where the foreign policy, where none of the states that I studied in Europe nor international community is still open to Kosovo having its own state. Then it comes to the role of the connection to the non-state actors. I mean, here these are the LDK, the government that is in quotation marks, of course, and the alternative radical faction. This leads, in my account, to a dual-pronged contention and different ways of channeling it. So I will show to you how it looks like. So a broker in Germany mentioned about the vast organizational work that was done on behalf of the government, again with quotation marks, because this was not, I mean, it was government for some of these people, but it was a non-state actor for the international community. So, I mean, I talk about this and how we label them, how we think about them, but I definitely take up an international community point of view about what government and non-state actor is and what a party is. Although in the diaspora parlance, this is different, and this may induce different kind of engagement. So this person talked about building more than 200 organizations, arranged meetings for the LDK officials in the German Bundestag, and the vast organizational structure that was building on a 3% informal tax that all Kosovars were levied in order to sustain the parallel structures of the state, were important for this person to show, as is a quote, to show to Western countries that we can be organized and do not need financial support. We are asking for moral support. And also that the LDK is not a ragtag organization and has a clear position, but is not compromising. I mean, compare this statement, however true. I mean, we're not in a position here to figure out how much all of this is 100% true, right? But compare this kind of discourse and activity to the one previously mentioned. I mean, this is definitely much more close to a non-state actor and much more firm in terms of how it pursues both the contentious and the non-contentious aspects. So look at the local in government in Germany, who says, as a student, I was very active in organizing demonstrations in contentious politics, petitions, welcoming, accompanying guests, translating, organizing concerts, and doing all the logistics of the Albanian club, which are falling in the non-contentious category. The distant, there were examples of this in Germany and the Netherlands, was um, usually limiting their influence to Albanian clubs, many that function transnationally. Many sympathize with the LDK or with the KLA or organized and joint demonstrations on their behalf, as well as other contentious activities. So it seems like the person who is more removed from the context of the host land is much more susceptible to these external influences of non-state actors, and sometimes they may be even their activists or protagonists. The interesting thing is here is that the reserved is absent. So in my view, the reserved, when I looked in all of the people who are classified as reserved, they're really adverse to the idea of engaging with contentious actors and contentious behaviors in general. But then under certain circumstances, they become activated. And this is definitely not their circumstance. The earlier was where they had some sort of limited autonomy. They can engage, even if it's not very high profile, but they still mobilize. While here they try generally to stay away from it. And then the pathway 9 is the last one where you have the most contention, and it is still happening here under foreign policy divergence. But there are critical events, as kind of large-scale violence that happened in Kosovo in 1998, 1999, where Serbian forces were fighting with the radical KLA on the ground, and there was bringing to a lot of human rights violations, to a lot of refugee movements that created huge international repercussions and were very visible also to people abroad. So here we have all different kinds of diaspora entrepreneurs engaged, and yet in different ways. Right? Brokers do not see their lobbying activities, but they intensify their contentious action. They organize protests that become commonplace and widespread. They usually invite local officials and party functionaries of the host state. And one of them said in Sweden, when we wanted to make Sweden the Swedes supporters, we protested. I mean, Sweden has very little Albanians compared to Germany, let's say. But the protest was an effective tool at that time. The brokers also participated in fundraising and drafting some informal conversations for mentioning. So I want to also emphasize one thing that here we need to look at, and this is about transnationally organized protests, because sometimes this is a blind spot, especially for researchers who are adopting a status lens of thinking about host states, homelands, and countries in the diaspora. And this is because at that time, transnational protest was very common. So people from one place move to another and they get bussed around Europe, which if you think about the transnational social field dynamic is quite fitting with it. But if you think about the dynamic that is statist, it doesn't fit into it. So even in this sense, locals who went to who were protesting in where they were, but they also went on transnational protests to Bonn, to Stuttgart, to Amsterdam and Geneva. Locals, and especially distant, went to Kosovo. Some took a break from work. Others were happy to pay for the war, not to jeopardize a tricky immigration status. And even the reserve, the one that I said is really adverse to any of these activities, usually staying out and opting out of contention, comes out of their shell, in quotation marks, and start organizing domestically and transnationally. And women, for example, are very few among the reserved. This is when they also become quite active. So, we can talk about, if you're interested, about this dynamic later on. So I'm coming towards the concluding remarks of this talk. Just want to say that after I talk about these three chapters, three sections, right, Albanian field and mobilizations and Palestinian and Armenian, I have a comparative chapter. But this comparative chapter is looking into different states in which the diasporas are embedded, but have a different goal. First of all, it has a goal to show comparative analysis beyond methodological nationalism, as I mentioned before, so that we, even if we talk about states in which diasporas live, to think about this in a different way about how can we unpack that state is dynamic. Here, the comparative analysis is very strong in terms of looking into how these causal pathways repeat themselves across different cases and across transnational social fields. Right? In this whole story so far, you haven't seen a lot of like in this country or in that country, apart from data points that maybe some statements of certain diaspora entrepreneurs. And that specific chapter is talking about comparative analysis, showing how host states and places within them shape diaspora mobilization, especially in channeling contention. So they are not explaining causation, but they are showing how certain mobilizations are shaped in order to be processed in a different way. For example, I have a very important discussion about migration integration regimes and what this really matters, because a lot of these diaspora entrepreneurs are considered to be usually in discourses non-integrated citizens, while many of them are very integrated. Most of them are very integrated, what my data shows, but their socio-spatial linkages are different, which shows what actually the causality is. And then I show, for example, federal versus unitary state structures, how they may matter. In Germany, some of the länder are much more conducive to diaspora mobilizations, like North Rhine-Westphalia or Hessen, compared to others that are coming from, with historical legacies of the communist world. I mean, Saxony or any other. Similarly, we can talk about how, for example, Palestinians have been quite eager on pursuing some of their causes through Scotland, with more of the devolved state of the United Kingdom, and Armenians to try to do this by way of the Welsh Assembly in Wales. I talk about systems of interest mediation and trade union politics, and how in the UK it may be much more contentious because of kind of these pluralist elements, while in others it's much more dampened, and protest is less so effective or desired as a tool. And then I talk finally about something that I have started talking, but it's also part more kind of has taken in the literature, about the socio-spatial influence of place. So how certain connectivities of places may influence diaspora mobilizations. If you're in Berlin, for example, or in London, how this would matter. But for me, this is very important to look deeper beyond earlier discussions and look how this really applies to the different types of diaspora entrepreneurs. If you are a broker and a local in Berlin, how would this matter for you? For example, or I have very good examples from the Armenian case. If you are a local in London, which is a global city, you would definitely have very few global connections, global people to mobilize, but will focus more on those people who are for a long time part of the UK or just come as refugees, etc., but not on the global cosmopolitan diaspora. So this would be the place of London that would matter for the global cosmopolitan diaspora to mobilize, and yet on other dynamics and on other ways. So this socio-spatial positionality is not like that it has also the same effect on everybody. It's also important who is connected, how to that place. So that's why connection to people in place is really important. So in sum, the book introduces a novel typology about diaspora entrepreneurs and their socio-spatial linkages, a two-level typological theory, and accounting for mobilizations of contention and how interest is channeled. Looks into this interaction between diaspora entrepreneurs, host-land foreign policies, homeland governments, parties, non-state actors, and limited global influences. And I want to say, I think this offers the first systematic comparative analysis of diaspora lobbying in Europe. I mean, there have been other works out there, but none of that kind of magnitude. I mean, comparing these mobilizations in 7 countries, including the European Union, and also using evidence from the European neighborhood. And what might be interesting to this audience it is that integrates the study of fragile statehood with that of migrants incorporation and transnationalism, usually discussions that are totally on their own, and here they kind of integrate together. Final slide is about some excerpts from endorsements. Professor Jennifer Brinkerhoff from George Washington University said this book is essential reading for understanding how diasporas mobilize in such different ways, and that it suggests an important shift of how we should understand and investigate IR. Gary Gertz, a professor of conflict analysis and methodology at the University of Notre Dame, said this is a tour de force, combining different literatures, an impressive combination of theoretical and methodological rigor. Emeritus Professor Robert Rothberg said everybody who cares about the critical impact of these diasporic actors can now turn into this timely, methodologically sophisticated book for meaningful and policy-shaping insights. Professor Nat Lebeau from King's College London found this to be a definitive study of diaspora mobilizations, conceptually sophisticated and empirically rich. And Professor Andrew Geddes from the European University Institute, who is leading the Migration Center there, says this is a fresh, innovative, and compelling perspective into the mobilization of conflict-generated diasporas built on a bedrock of impressive empirical evidence. So here I am. Thank you for your attention. Time for a Q&A. And if you want to have more information about the book, please don't hesitate to write to me. I'm at Warwick University, and you can always Google me, but this is my email. Thanks a lot. So now, Juliet, I'm going to, we're going to finish with the recording, right?
Yes.